Autumn, thank you for joining us for the Claima Stories podcast. Welcome to Portland. Good to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Good to have you. You had some fun flight situations.
Yeah, it's never a dull moment. I'm like, I need a direct flight from DC.
Portland needs more direct flights. We need a little bit more of that.
Yeah.
'Cause right now, travel is just not as easy as I'd like to be. Did you
Right.
see President Biden was calling for airlines to start giving passengers cash due to like long delays and cancellations from the
Really?
airlines? Yeah.
No.
I was like, I support that one.
that
take some
was
more money in my pocket.
that was recent?
That was today. This
Oh,
morning.
okay. No,
He
so
announced it
look.
this morning.
Oh gosh, no, I missed that. I know, like specifically from DC, what they're working on with Reagan National is implementing longer haul flights, and just longer haul in terms of going across North America, because they were so worried at one point in time about air traffic and cluttering that they restricted the number of flights that could be direct, specifically from East Coast to West Coast.
Yeah.
So hopefully that change is coming. I know I can fly direct to Seattle, but
You're
to
like, I'm
Portland,
coming to Portland often, so I need to have some accommodation.
I mean, something like it.
Yeah, that's been the tough thing is you gotta go to Seattle,
Yep.
right? Or you gotta go to LA or something.
Or I'm flying into Phoenix, and then Phoenix to Portland. I'm like, what route is this? But I got here.
You got here.
Yeah.
You're all right. So
Yes.
you're in DC
Yes.
right now, right? But you're originally from Chicago.
From Chicago.
Chicago kid.
Yes.
What was childhood like for you growing up in Chicago?
Childhood. It was beautiful, I'd say. Aside from like, those moments of being a teenager and trying like to just, find yourself and
You gotta
going
have
at it with your
experiences.
parents. Yeah, exactly. It was good. We had freedom,
What
and
did freedom look like to you?
freedom looked like operating without fear.
Mm.
I
Like
find
fear of getting in trouble or fear of making a mistake?
yeah, well, or just fear of like, not going outside and having something happen to you, and I think, hey, there was some fear put in us or instilled in us in terms
In
of,
the
okay, no,
household.
like when we go outside, we're going to be on our best behavior, because we know that there might be someone on the bus that knows our parents and will, go back and say, hey, I saw them acting a fool.
So Autumn,
You know?
that's what Autumn was up to.
Exactly. But, we still had the freedom to be outside, to, go downtown, go to the lake, explore. I came up in the height of, not even in the height, because then, would probably put me in like the 70s or something. I'm like, yeah, the height of, like B-boys and all of that. No, not the case. But, we were in Hyde Park, which is, still, I would say, such like a center of culture in Chicago on the South Side. So when you think about just like music and dance and things of that sort, we came up in that. We came up. I wasn't personally, breakdancing, but I was around the folks that, that did, or the folks that were tagging. My husband was one of those kids. But yeah, grew up running track and just,
What was
and
your event?
4x1,
Oh.
yeah, and 200.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Sprinter.
So yeah, like went to the National Junior Olympics a couple times.
Oh, you was fast, huh?
We were okay. Chicago didn't necessarily breed the fastest runners. LA, Florida, when you can practice outdoor, all year
All year
round.
round.
But yeah, I think that also just sort of speaks to the freedom, like just getting out on the track and just like running, right?
Going.
So yeah, childhood really, it helped to shape, of course, yes, who I am today.
What do you think about when you think about childhood in Chicago and all those different influences that were happening of that time? What kind of is a part of you today? Like that's a part of your day-to-day demeanor that you would say is like distinctly from Chicago?
Just being real. I think in Chicago, I came up under entrepreneurs, right? My dad is an entrepreneur. My mom is a creative spirit. In high school, I worked in, I managed coffee shops in high school, and these are, I worked under the owners. I worked under the owners at a popular like retail destination. And, you get such a mix of different people coming into all those spaces, right? And so you naturally just absorb, as a youth, right?
Yeah.
You're still being molded, you absorb what is being presented to you,
you're
right?
seeing all these interesting people. You're like, you kind of borrow little bits and pieces. Some pieces you disregard.
Yep. No, and right, exactly. Right, exactly. You have to like have that filter, right? And I thank, God and my parents for allowing me to, have some discernment in terms of what I do take
What
in.
you do take.
Right. But yeah, I mean, it's just like an element of just like of realness and, being able to watch people really live out their dreams and do it being them, is something that I believe I really held on to. Yeah, and it sort of just made me who I am today.
Yeah, I mean, it's something about if you're able to be young and at a place where you're really absorbing, really being a sponge, you don't have this pressure to be something. And I mean, I would venture to say you don't really have that pressure today. It's kind of pressure we put on ourselves. But you get what I'm saying. And to be able to see people that look like you doing these different things, I can imagine it's like, oh, wow, what kind of impression is that going to have on you as you get older?
Yeah.
Now, what you described to me as you're bringing in Chicago, I would say is not as often the narrative that gets touted in Chicago. It's usually this narrative around violence.
Yeah.
What was your experience with that when you were, young and there? Like you described it as being free, but did you ever where's that narrative coming from? How does that impact you?
So I mean, violence was around. It was happening, right? It just wasn't amplified via social media, right? And it was much more targeted. So like if you weren't in that mix,
It never
it
impacted
didn't,
you?
yeah. So it was, just kept to those certain blocks. Like, yeah, we had everything taking place at at our high school and whatnot. But if you were out of that, you didn't have much to be concerned about.
Yeah.
So in that regard, it made you street smart, like you knew not.
You knew where you shouldn't be involved,
exactly.
what time you shouldn't be involved, like all of these things you kind of knew, like,
Yep.
this ain't really my lifestyle.
Exactly. And I think, nowadays it is just, it's rampant, and I mean, granted, yes, you do have the media, news outlets, social media highlighting everything that is taking place.
All the time.
But I do feel that it is still like more happening these days, And
But not even just there, everywhere.
No, it's everywhere.
Right?
No, yeah. And that's what, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Which is sad.
It's a tough thing to think about, like how much violence is taking place now. But pivoting back to more of the positive things, you stayed away from a lot of that stuff. You were more involved in the creative community, right? What was some of that creative community before you went off to college? Like, what were you involved in?
Yep. So as I mentioned, I ran a coffee shop. I was, how old was I at that time? Goodness, 15. So I had like my work permit.
Yeah.
So 15, legit operating like this 2-story coffee shop in Hyde Park. And, all of my friends would come by after school, and I'm making white chocolate mochas and things of that sort, answering the phones and, just really like being responsible for getting people's day off to, the right start, of course, on the weekends, or just, making sure that they end their day, positively, right? So that was the beginning of it. And, from there, I transitioned to working for a local brand called Tony Sports, and it, was a mainstay in Chicago.
What was there? So Tony Sports, was it like general sports apparel, or like what?
No. So it was all of your streetwear.
Okay.
Yeah. So all of your streetwear, all of your sneakers. Yeah. Brian and I were just doing we were just featured on an app, talking about sneakers. And, we talked about, as kids, there were always lines for Mikes. There were always lines for Jordans, and that, that was the culture,
That was
right?
the culture, yeah.
And so Tony Sports, they were a retailer. for Jordan. So, you know, I was working during, you know, some of those moments and, you know, outfitting everybody from like, you know, your, you know, local single mom to parents to, you know, street dudes to, you know, all types
Whoever,
of folks.
yeah, all
would
walks of
come,
life.
Yes, would come in there, right? And yeah, and again, I was, you know, the person that was, you know, outfitting them and engaging with them and, you know, and just making sure that the experiences that I had were meaningful, you know, and that were, you know, coming from the heart. I've always taken the approach with retail as, you know, I don't want you outside making me look crazy, you know, so I'm not just selling, I'm not just going to sell you something to sell you something, right? Because when you step outside,
they're going to ask you where you got it from.
Exactly.
Like, well, why did
she do that to you? You know, and mind you, I was 17 at this time, still taking that approach, right? And yeah, and you know, as I mentioned, it was great to be able to see Tony and Nana, the operators of, goodness, I think at its height, there were maybe 5 locations.
Wow.
You know, but to see this, you know, husband and wife team operating in this capacity,
that's so dope.
Not necessarily even knowing that, okay, that would be, you know, my life.
Yeah, the way your life would go. Now you got the worker's permit and you're working at 15 and you're managing, you're in these leadership roles pretty early on at a young age. What were some of the experiences that shaped that ability or mentality or way of thinking for you where you're totally comfortable doing that? Or maybe you weren't. I don't know. What was the situation?
You know, I guess just one, people just trusting me in those roles, you know, and having expectations of me and me not wanting to let them down, you know, and it wasn't as much like, it's not like, oh, you know, there was just so much pressure for me to perform, but naturally I just, you know, I don't know if this tracks back to me being a Capricorn, but, you know, I work hard, you know, and I, you know, understand what it means to, I don't want to say necessarily to make someone happy because that's not it, you know, but I understand what it looks like to get the job done.
You understand service, you understand quality, right? Upholding a certain brand and expectation. Because if you're managing, whether you're managing a coffee shop or you're managing a sneaker spot or running your own thing, like you want everyone to have a great experience, right? Because at the end of the day, that's how you stay in business.
Something memorable. You know.
And then to your point, like those are moments that brighten people's days. You know, I know that routine when you're going to get that coffee, like your interaction with the barista and the folks that work there, it's a part of that routine. Certain people go to certain spots because they want to see those people kick off their day. So it's a part of that journey. But you would decide to venture out from Chicago and ended up going to Howard. Some would say the only HBCU that matters.
You know, look, you know what? Look, I wouldn't say that at all. I look, those are not words.
Hey, I got to shout out SU. I'm from Baton Rouge.
Look, right, exactly. So, you know, like, I mean, look, HBCUs, they've made impact on, you know, on our lives, right? But yeah, Howard, that's where I went.
That's where you went. What pointed you in that direction? What was it about Howard that you were like, I have to absolutely go there?
So 8th grade field trip from Chicago to DC. You know, we were all bussed down, 8th grade, you know, class, you know, probably acted a fool, you know, during that time. But I remember vividly being on campus and saying, this is where I want to go.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. So
in the 8th grade.
In the 8th grade.
That's fly.
Yep. And so, you know, I applied. You know, my dad really wanted me to go to NYU. He's a, you know, Bronx native. And that wasn't on my heart.
Where you went?
No.
Yeah. You're like, I'm gonna go to Howard. I'm gonna have a great experience.
Yeah.
Now, so when you go to Howard, what starts to happen for you personally? How do you start to see personal growth? What are you starting to get invested in?
Right. So, you know, Personally, I was, coming into, became a woman, so to speak, at Howard, right? I'm finding my interests. They still heavily lie within retail, within fashion. And I'm like, okay, what does that look like for me? So, identify marketing as my track. And got interested in music. I was blessed to be able to have a mentor in Chanel Thomas, who brought me onto her street team. So, we were holding up NORE posters, during homecomings and everything, and stapling the flyers to the light poles and all of that. And, from there, it led to opportunities within the music industry. So Universal Music and Video Distribution. And on campus, brought together a few of my other classmates that were working within the industry, and we created a student organization called EPP, which stood for Industry Power Players. So industry with an E, because it was related to the entertainment industry. So, we formed this group. I was the first president.
Of course you were.
And it was all about exposing the student body to opportunities within the industry. And, from there, we were able to leverage, the actual jobs that we had, some of them internships, some of them actual jobs, and we were able to bring artists to campus. So
recording artists.
NERD at Crampton, brought them there. Who else did we bring? The band.
The band. With the
yes. So it's so crazy because that caused a stampede at Blackburn, bringing the band to Howard University.
Yeah.
Crazy. Who would have thought?
I know, but it's that time, that pocket of culture.
Oh my gosh.
Everyone was watching them.
It was Dylon
Dillinger. Yo.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So you're in the mix, right? You're in the industry, you're doing your thing, you're all good. One of the things I wanted to put a pin on as well, though, was your partner of 17 years, you had met prior to all of this. You met in middle school or something like that, right? So how's that ride been for the two of you, right? You got this long-term relationship.
No. We gotta track it back.
You met, but
did
y'all
not
weren't
get it. Yes.
What's happening?
So we actually met in grammar school. That's a Chicago term, grammar school. So that pretty much spans, kindergarten through 8th grade. But we met when I was in the 7th grade. And we didn't get together until my senior year of college.
College?
Yes.
Did he go to Howard as well?
No, he didn't. He went to U of I.
Okay.
Yeah. But when I would come home, we would be in the same spaces, same friends. And I'm like, oh, I have a crush on him. And he was completely oblivious. But, here we are, 17 years later, married 17 years later. And that's making
wild.
making things work.
That's wild to have known your partner that young, and then to get together afterward.
Yeah.
But what were some of those shared commonalities, interests, and values that brought you two together?
I think it was our upbringing. Both being from Hyde Park. I think automatically it just it feels like home, right? We had a love for. And I don't just always want to say fashion, because that's not it. It's more so it's style, So Brian came from the sneaker space, sneaker world, heavy into Foot Locker and everything in those days. And, on the flip side, I was, more boutique retail. But, it was those shared interests that caused us, to connect. And even just having those in common, there's a ton of things that we don't, have in common, right? That makes
those
it work.
Y'all's things,
yes,
individually,
but also just the entrepreneurial drive. He had a restaurant that he, had in college, and like similar to me and working within that space and just like, being able to carve out, paths for ourselves,
And generate, and wealth, you know what I mean? Like, it's a part of, and independence and freedom, like all these different things come along with it.
Yep.
One of the things I find super interesting about the two of you is that you would go into business together as well, right? And so this was after you graduated, 2007-ish?
Yep, 2007. So it was right after we got married. So, I mean, like, we were crazy, essentially. Like, when you look back at it, right, it's like, we're early 20-somethings, mid 20-somethings. Like, okay, hey, not only are we just now going to get married, we're also going to build a business, together.
Stacking it.
Right. So, we're planning for a wedding with, boxes of inventory being shipped to, our house for, our soon to be open retail space.
Yeah.
But we did it.
Oh my goodness.
We did it.
What do you remember about that time? Because that's a lot, right? The wedding planning alone is a lot. Then a business and retail and inventory, that's a lot.
It is a lot, but I remember just being so excited about this. It was a time in which, we were doing this together.
Yeah.
He was working at a real estate company at the time, and I was working at a boutique, so doing like the management and buying for this boutique, and we came into Ouija from the Brooklyn Circus. And Ouija is our brother. And, at that point in time, it was like, okay, hey, I'm looking for, some Chicago representation from the Brooklyn Circus or for the Brooklyn Circus. And we were like, okay, let's see, what we can do, right? Yeah. Because Brian was ready to leave his job. I had ultimately gotten fired from that, that was the only job that I ever got fired from. Wow. And it was because me and one of the owners who, wasn't present, he didn't like the direction that I was taking his establishment. I was definitely going more streetwear, and he wanted a little bit more. It was still Red Monkeys and, and I'm like, no, let's bring in Susie and, and Fresh Jive and, right. Like we gotta like switch this up a little bit. So, I mean, it was a blessing in disguise.
I mean, sometimes that's the way it happens, right? And it, you can fight it as much as you want to, but a lot of times it's really guiding you to where ultimately you should be in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you said that because Red Monkey is not around.
No, exactly. It's not. It's not.
Right? You know what I mean? So you were actually trying to push them in a direction to keep them relevant and in business. I have to imagine, did it feel more comfortable for you and your partner Brian going into opening your own space, because both of you already had experience in kind of some of these worlds, so it wasn't, while there is still the fear of the unknown, it wasn't like we don't completely not know what we're doing.
Right. Yeah, no, and it did feel comfortable in that regard. And and I know I mentioned a mentor, like, previously, but in this case, I mean, Ouija was a mentor for us. He did it in Brooklyn and, was soon to do it in San Francisco and, was able to sort of guide us through this process. So yeah, we felt pretty confident.
How important was it to have Ouija as someone that y'all could reach out to as you were building?
I mean, of the utmost importance. I mean, like, I mean, not to say we couldn't have done it because we would have figured out a way. But I mean, he like helped to open so many, doors for us, especially as it like, related to us going into, a cut and sew, business. And we talk about showing up at projects and all these trade shows, like that was, Ouija.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Although, I mean, we completely screwed it up the first time.
You're going to.
I mean, like we went from never like producing any garment, right? Any cut and sew garment to producing 2 seasons of men's and women's apparel to show at projects.
2 seasons worth?
2 seasons worth.
Why not just 1?
Who knows? I can't. This was so long ago. I can't even. I don't even know why we did that. Maybe one was like for immediate order, and then the other, were the
something-
samples that we wanted to, like
forecasting, all
yes,
that stuff, futures.
yes.
What went wrong?
I mean, the pattern making in the beginning,
Ooh.
like that was something that, I mean, we brought on like a relatively new like designer, and they were used to creating patterns a certain way, so not necessarily for full production, but just for them to to personally sew it, right? So we had to scrap that and then do it all over again. But again, we showed up, and taking it back, it's just, okay, if we say that we're going to do it,
we got to do it. You would change the name, right? I think it's around 2010. You changed the name to Sir and Madam.
Yeah.
What was the reason?
We wanted a brand that was at least like the representation of it in terms of naming, right? We wanted something that was a little bit more timeless. Soulmates was the first iteration of our business together. It was rooted in sneaker consignment. And played off of us being, soulmates, right? So we ended up, Brian came up with the name Soulmates, and then I came up with the name Sir and Madam. So we each had our, each had our go at it. And it's still like, it stood for us, it represented us. And, we were able to partner with a designer at that time who was just coming out of Ralph Lauren, who created this, amazing, just like, branding kit for us. And we're like, okay, this is it. Like so many people have been asking us to, to make some apparel and things of that sort. And we're like, what does it look like for that to just be Soulmates? Soulmates didn't have like really two legs to stand on as it, pertains to me just rocking that across my chest. Right. So that was ultimately
So one of the things I'm dying to speak with you about is working with your partner in business and working together and not finding ways not to butt heads, right? Because it is something that both of you are passionate about. You're both, working in the business. So I imagine y'all had decided who was going to stay in a certain area and streams, or like, how did you?
Of course not.
No.
It did not start off like that. It didn't, again, we were young. We were really young, and at that juncture, we didn't have the cut and sew component of our business yet. It was legit just us, going in and handling like sneaker consignment and, some wholesale retail. Fast forward, as the brand grew, we were able to really identify, as the brand grew and as we worked together a bit more, we were able to identify what each other's strengths were and what our, weaknesses were, right? Or our areas of opportunity, as I like to call it. And in realizing that, that's when, the partnership really came together. That's when I think we came to respect each other even more and respect what it is we bring to the table and the spaces that we, that we both play in.
Right.
It got to the point where I'm like, okay, yes, Brian is, responsible for, the manufacturing, design and manufacturing, and I handle, retail sales and marketing, and that's what it is, Yep. And I mean, of course, like, we both spend time sort of, ideating,
tapping
figuring
in,
out, like,
course.
okay, what do we want this, this season to be about, or this drop to be about? But we both recognized, okay, like when to pull back, or at least I did, because I'm like, you know what? Hey, you got your vision.
You got it. Do your thing. I trust you.
Roll with it, right? I trust you, but hey, if that one doesn't work, I'm not gonna say I told you so, but I'm like, I don't know about that colorway. I'm like, we're typically like, pretty subtle, but yeah, we got to the point in which we were really just able to work in our lanes, operate in our lanes, and maintain like that balance and some boundaries, because things do inevitably sort of seep into, your marriage and pillow talk and things of that sort.
How do you kind of put those boundaries up, right? Well, my wife is also an entrepreneur, but we don't work in each other's businesses together. But we do find like, you know, like we have a silly thing where it's like, yo, at past 8 p.m., don't tell me nothing about no business. Yeah. You know, like that's one of our boundaries.
Yeah, no, for real. Yeah. And, you know, and then I think like you have to be straight up in your communication where it's like, hey, in the morning, I can't, don't put a lot on me, you know, especially as it pertains to, you know, to business. Let's just make sure that we, you know, get out the house, you know, with everyone intact, you know, everyone in as best a mood as possible. And, you know, after you have a matcha, I might have some coffee. Maybe we can regroup, hop on a quick call, and we work that out.
And we work that out. But let me get up to speed and make sure life is good before we just jump right into the things that was on the top of your mind when you woke up.
Yes, right? Exactly.
Like you still got to set space and time for those things. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think sometimes people have some guilt around like, oh, I can't talk about it right now. I feel like, you know, maybe I'm not listening or being an active participant, but it's like sometimes it's just protecting yourself.
No, you have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm going to respect you if you tell me now is not the right time.
Yeah, now I don't have the capacity to go there with you.
Yep.
You had mentioned, you know, the mentorship capacity with Ouija and Brooklyn Circus. Was there ever any crossover in y'all's businesses from a partnership standpoint or product or collaborations or anything like that?
Yeah, we did collaborate.
Tell me about that.
So, goodness, when was that? This was still when we were soulmates. We collaborated on a design. You know, Chicago at that point in time, they were like really caught up in Chicago being a city of haters, right? And Brian and I never wanted to take that approach because the reason why we established ourselves in Chicago, and the reason why I moved back to Chicago from DC was to make a contribution to the creative community, right? Just knowing that the more we sort of have to go around, the more eyes that'll be on us and the more, you know, opportunities that will come to us, you know, to, you know, designers and boutique owners in the city. It's like, hey, it's enough to go around.
It's enough to go around. It's not just because someone else has and no one else can get it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So, you know, so we collaborated on a design that, you know, was just about like, you know, bringing brands together, you know, doing the lockup of, you know, at that time it was Soulmates still and in the Brooklyn Circus. And then, you know, we collaborated on other projects in the future with PF Flyers and what else did we do? You know, of course, there were like, you know, content collaborations.
Absolutely,
you know,
being able to tell that story.
Yeah, you know, we would do Style Wars with, you know, our Chicago team and then like the Brooklyn and SF teams. Yeah. And so it would be like, you know, one jacket styled however many ways. And, you know, and that really kept, you know, all of our bases engaged. Yeah. You know, it was dope.
It was dope. I mean, you got to do different. I mean, you know, you work in marketing and in all these different areas, you know, like you got to figure out creative solutions to keep folks interested. One of the things that's been on, you know, my mind, I've been speaking a lot about, I feel like everybody, talking to a lot of people about collaborations lately. What's your temperature on your approach to collaborations and how do you approach them in a way where you feel like they are actually meaningful to your community?
Right. I mean, one, it has to make sense from the jump. You know, not every opportunity is a good opportunity, right? So it's, you know, what is the objective behind this collaboration? Like, what are we looking to do? What story are we looking to tell? And what are we looking to gain from this? You know, and so if all of that can align and make sense, then you're working with something.
Right.
You know, I'm very passionate about, you know, leading from a place that is authentic. And so me forcing anything, like, I mean, that's just not me.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's one reason, too, why I didn't continue working in the music industry after college, because, you know, there were so many stories about just becoming jaded, about, like, you know, like just what you had to push out, right? And I'm like, if I'm not standing behind, half of this.
projects,
I'm
yeah.
like, how am I supposed to really support it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, granted, I could figure out a way, but
Yeah, but then that's the forcing part,
Yep.
right? You're trying to pull at straws to find a way to connect to something where you're like, I don't really vibe with this
Yep.
in the first place.
Yep.
But in that industry, you felt like it was more about quantity and how many like hits you could put out versus if they meant anything from
Exactly.
an origin standpoint. Yeah.
Yep.
In your retail fashion kind of sneaker experience, though, there are opportunities that were coming from Nike to Foot Locker. And now, would you say those were coming, were you seeking those out, or did you feel like a lot of those were just becoming because of the brand that was built?
It was because of the brand
Yeah.
that was built. The brand and our approach to it.
Yeah, yeah. I love it. When you build something strong enough, it's like people are going to come, right? Because they believe in what you're doing. Now with all that, like you got the business, you got your relationship, and then you got kids in the mix too, right? What you call your little wild things.
Yep.
How's the journey been with having a lot of all of that in harmony?
It's been amazing.
Yeah.
It's been rewarding. It's been challenging.
Yeah.
All of the things. But what part of, the journey isn't that?
Yeah.
I have learned to lean into what is being presented and not to approach it with tension, because then it automatically creates, some friction.
Yeah.
So, I ask for patience, pray for patience every day. I'm like, let me, just work through things.
Yep.
But, in terms of like the kids, it's wonderful for them to be able to see us, to see me, and there's no facade. It is, I lead from an authentic place with my kids. I think, in coming up, we looked at our parents as superheroes.
Of course.
And it was so many things that they didn't make us privy to that we didn't know. But did that help us, or did it, hinder us a bit, especially coming into adulthood?
There's so much we didn't know, weren't aware of about the world that, I think in their eyes, sometimes they're like, oh, we were protecting you.
Yeah.
Protection can only go for so long.
Yeah.
So you have to protect yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's important just for them to see us, to know us, because I'm Autumn before I'm their mom. I'm always their mom, but I have to, be my own person to be the best person I can.
To be to them.
Yeah. For them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I mean, I see them as their own little people that they are, and I mean, they're amazing and along for the ride, and at least in like my son's eyes, I'm still seen as it's pretty cool. My daughter, she's like, oh, you're embarrassing me, or at least, then
it
my
always comes back
youngest,
around.
she's just figuring out,
she's like,
the dirt
Mom.
and the, grass. So.
It comes back around. Trust.
Yes.
Now y'all end up moving. Yeah. You moved from Chicago to DC. How did that impact the business? What did that mean for the business?
Yeah, so, it depends on which business, right? In Chicago, we had our brick and mortar, Sir and Madam, and, truth be told, it was always the question of, okay, is this physical space still serving us in the way in which we need it to? Yeah. So there were many times in which we would have the conversation about, like going more so towards a studio space, right? Appointment only and things of that sort, right? Or just, altogether just closing down, the brick and mortar and focusing online and focusing more on wholesale. But, you fast forward, we're still open, start of the pandemic. But all the while, Brian was, working on his business Manifest, which is a concept space in DC, barbershop, speakeasy, retail space,
fire.
2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment. Yeah, wonderful space. So, as he's working on those plans, and we still, have Sir Madam operating in some capacity during the pandemic. The question came about as far as, me taking over as, head of operations for the business. So, DC has always been a place that I hold very near and dear, having gone to Howard. And I'm like, okay, why not? Like, let's do it. It is like crazy to think that in Chicago, we don't want for anything.
At all, right? You got all your family there.
Right. I mean, all our family, all of our, business, all the opportunities that, that are coming to us. Like, we're good in Chicago. But it was like, okay, hey, let's figure this out. So that means that, I resigned from my position of head of membership and communications at Soho House, transitioned to DC. We pick up the family, the dog, and we, head out east.
Head out east.
Yeah, head out east and begin and shutter the store, of course. And we begin to put a ton of energy into Manifest. And, we get that open. And I mean, it's a beautiful space. Yeah, Snarkitecture designed it. Very, very intentional. And it's a project that we both, still worked on.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So, granted the conversations, that pillow talk was a little bit more intense because there's a lot more at stake.
Yeah. I have to imagine investments higher. There's a lot more on the line.
A lot more on the line. Yeah, so, while it was beautiful to like really work in such an intimate like space together, like, once Harper rolled around, once the baby came, it was like, okay, let's figure out, these next steps. And, I was throughout this whole process, I still have been working with Soho House in a contractual capacity, helping to grow the DC base. And the opportunity came about to, transition back into the company as head of membership for North America. And yeah, it made sense. It was an opportunity for me to, work remote with, a new baby, and then to give us a little bit of space,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You gotta have any additional stability during that time.
Yep.
Is a great thing.
Yep.
Right. How's been the experience with Soho House?
It's been great.
Yep.
I think like Soho House has always been a part of my life that just so seamlessly fits. When I first was exposed to the brand, that was, was it 11 years ago? I can't even remember the date, but as a founding member of the Chicago House. And at that time it's like, okay, yes, we have this business, Sir and Madam, I'm doing account work for Game 7, so overseeing that Chicago office. This is a place where I can take my meetings, I can gather, and I can actually leverage this space to my to my benefit in terms of exposing people to what like I have going on. So that transition from member to to membership, and now back, like Soho is really represents who I am and what it is I do. And that's, I'm really passionate about connecting people, and curating spaces, and, just putting some strategy behind it all. I always tell my team to lead with what you're passionate about. And, that space really allows them to do so and allows me to do so.
I love it. You got a lot of different things moving about. So, of course, I have to ask you, how do you take care of Autumn? What do you do to make sure that you have your space to show up as you first? So, as you said, so you can also be your best self when you're with other folks as well.
Exactly. So, I am a 4:30 riser now. because I recognize that I have to have the time in the morning for myself, to get to the gym, just to have, some peace and quiet. I can wake up, I can pray, I can go work out. I still have time to, get home and make some oatmeal. I sound like I'm probably like 76 or something, but this is where, I am in life, right? And, I am, after like all my traveling is said and done, I am okay now with just being at home.
Yeah.
Like, I am good to sort of, pop in, show face, say hello, be present.
Yep.
But then, once I go home, I'm home. And I feel zero pressure to have to show up in ways that I don't have the energy to do so. I'm very protective of my energy at this point in life. Yeah.
As you should, right? Like, again, it just goes back to like, if you want to be able to enjoy what you're doing, you got to put up things that allow you to do that. You can't just respond to everything and be involved in everything.
No, you can't. You can't.
Like, you are one person.
Yeah. And I'm happy that I've moved past that point in life. Like, no, it's okay. Like, I'm okay to miss this one. I can sit this one out. Yeah.
There'll be another one.
Yeah, and I'll keep up with you all, like, on social if I feel the need to.
Do that.
Yes. Other than that, catch me like watching Succession, folding some clothes, or maybe just laying on them.
Speaking to that, as you've worked through those different feelings and those urges to have to be in these different things and all that stuff, for these other folks coming up, young people coming up, whether, on their own or they're in relationships trying to build something together, what advice would you give them on the journey as creatives, as entrepreneurs, as just people?
Goodness. As just people. For the young folks, don't be afraid to try it all. I'm like, you have like youth on your side for a reason. Like, you can try it. But at some point in time, you do have to commit to actually, like, doing what it is you are truly interested in, right? And when you commit, like, really, really take the time and energy to make the most of it. And even if that's just setting, a deadline or giving yourself like a timeline to which, okay, hey, I'm going to commit to this for a period of 1 year. Do that. And then sit back and reflect and say, hey, did this serve me in the way that it needed to serve me? Because, I feel like that is, from the jump, I've pretty much known, that the direction that I've wanted to go in, but I know that that's not everyone's story, So, I would say, identify a mentor in some capacity. It could be a life, mentor. It could be a professional mentor, just someone who, is willing to help sort of just, guide you through this thing that we are working on, right? And then, as I talk about just like relationships, and this is relationships in general, right? See the humanity in people. Don't put expectations on other people that you don't have for yourself.
Thank you so much for that advice. That was excellent.
Anytime.
Thank you for joining us for the interview today. We appreciate you so much and wishing you best of luck on your journey.
Thank you.
Thank you.